I saw my daughter-in-law throw a leather suitcase into the lake. It sounds impossible even now, so ordinary a thing to say on the surface, and then such a violent, absurd image that it cleaves the day in two, everything before that splash and everything after. I remember the moment down to the tick of the kitchen clock. It was 5:15. My teacup, the one with the faint crack on the rim that Louis used to tease me about, was cooling on the saucer. A dust mote drifted in the afternoon light. Cynthia drove up the driveway like a storm. I had no idea what was about to happen. Louis had been gone 6 months. We had buried him in late spring, when the maples were a hard green canopy over the cemetery, and I kept thinking the earth had stolen the light. The coroner called it an accident. Most people said the right things at the funeral, and then went back to the lives that made sense. I had learned in those 6 months that grief settles into the small hours and the mundane, the way your hands find the same fingertip groove of a coffee mug, the way you leave the porch light on until dawn. I had not expected to be hurled back into a fight for a life on an October afternoon. Cynthia had always been volatile since Louis died. Sometimes she would pop into the house with a casserole and a soft smile. Sometimes she disappeared for days and sent messages that read like someone shouting into a void. That day she was sharp, a presence that vibrated. She stepped out of her car without closing the door, the leather suitcase at her feet. She stood on the shore for a long, terrible second, like she was deciding whether to step off a curb. Then she swung the case up. Once, twice. On the third swing, she threw it. The suitcase arced, hit the water with a muted boom, and sank, sending a spreading ring across Meridian Lake. I ran. The porch boards felt thin beneath my feet. I remember thinking, with a kind of ridiculous clarity, that my slippers would be ruined, and then they didn't matter. The wind down there held a smell of silverfish and wet earth. The lake ate the sound of the splashes and left something else behind, a small muffled noise that I only noticed once I had reached the shoreline. It was like a child stifling a cry. There were 2 slow, panicked seconds before I was in the water. The cold surprised me even though the air was mild. Meridian carries its own temperature, as if the lake were a different climate. The suitcase was heavier than it looked, full of the dense, unforgiving weight that water gives to ordinary things. I rolled it to the boat ramp and pried at the zipper with nails that felt numb. When I opened it, the smell hit me first, cold, wet cloth and something metallic. And then a face, a tiny, wrinkled face, hair matted with lake water, purple at the mouth, eyes closed. For a minute, everything else narrowed down to 2 things, the baby and the knowledge that I had not a moment to waste. I don't remember if the sun was exactly where it had been. Time does strange things in those seconds. I remember pulling the infant from the case, tucking in against me, and running to the house to warm him. I remember the sound of my voice, a thin, high thing, telling Cynthia, call 911, because she had a phone in her hand and was shaking like she had been standing in someone else's life. The 911 operator was calm in the way professionals are. Give me your location, give me your condition, put the baby on a towel, do not submerge him again. I wrapped the child in the Afghan I keep over the back of my couch, my mother's Afghan, heavy and smelling faintly of lavender, and we worked like we had all the time in the world and none of it at once. Cynthia kept repeating, he wasn't breathing, like reciting a catechism. Her hands trembled so badly she could hardly hold the radio the operator guided her through. I was sockless in the grass, my knees slack, and I felt 60 years of being a mother and a wife and a woman reduced to the singular task of getting this breathing body warm enough to breathe on its own. By the time the ambulance came, the baby had coughed, a ragged, drowning cough that sounded like a small animal trying to remember its voice. The paramedics were swift and efficient. They worked with a mechanical calm I envied. They wrapped him in heat packs, checked for a pulse, listened to his lungs. One of them said the word aloud, hypothermia, and with that, everything shifted from panic to a precise, fragile hope. A paramedic placed oxygen near the baby's nose. They intubated briefly at my insistence, though now I understand I was not asked. I was part of the chaos, and my voice carried because of how my hands gripped that David's Afghan. They loaded him into the ambulance. I climbed in beside the stretcher with my coat over the child's small body, and for the first time since Louis's funeral, I felt the universe narrow to a single path: keep this child breathing. At the emergency department, the world smeared into fluorescent light and a whirl of professionals. They took him straight to neonatal care. An intake nurse, Eloise, took me aside. She was younger than me by decades and older than I expected in the way nurses are, with a steady presence you can lean against. She wrapped my hands in both of hers and said, "We will do everything we can." I wanted to cling to that like a prayer. Instead I said, "Is he?" She bent her head and did not say alive until she had to say it. They worked to clear his airway, warmed him, placed him under the NICU's radiant heat. The first 8 hours were the strange, surreal blur of hospital practice. Notes, charts, questions whispered behind curtain partitions. Father Anthony from our parish appeared as if he had materialized from the prayer I had whispered on the porch. He held my hand and read a few words that made the room steadier.
His presence was not a promise that anything would turn out the way I wanted. It was simply human company in the worst of times. The doctor used terms I remember because I wrote them down: hypothermia, aspiration of water, near drowning. He told me the baby had low oxygen when they found him and that his core temperature had been dangerously low. No one spoke of miracles then. They spoke of the slow, accumulative work of medicine. Warmed him carefully, monitored for infection, watched for seizure activity. They fed him through a tube because his mouth and lungs were too raw to let him nurse yet. Cynthia sat in the waiting room with her head in her hands. Her face was a paper map of a person unraveling. She kept asking how he would be named. I had never felt such a need to be decisive about anything in my life. My chest was a knotted rope of grief and fierce love. At some point I said the name aloud. Hector, I told her. It sounded both familiar and brand new at the same time. She nodded like someone who will accept a direction when she cannot make one herself. Detective Fatima Salazar arrived an hour or so later. She wore no badge on her lapel when she spoke to us, just kind, steady eyes that were accustomed to people collapsing in front of them. She asked questions without looking for drama. How did you come to be here? Who was present? What did you see Cynthia do? I told her everything. The suitcase, the swing, the sound, my hands in the water, and she took notes. There was no accusatory tone in her voice. There had to be none. She needed facts. Facts are what stitch a story into something a court can understand. The hospital protocol pulled us along like a current. A social worker named Aline came to the NICU and drew up forms about custody and temporary guardianship. "We will need to follow state protocols," she said carefully. That line felt, in that moment, both necessary and cold. I had the baby under my coat in my arms, and they spoke the language of systems and policies. My instinct was simple: hold him and protect him, and keep him away from the person who had tried to drown him. The world had become much smaller and much more complicated at the same time. The baby slept and woke in a series of shallow breaths. The incubator's light made his skin look thin and translucent. You could see the little bones under his fists. Eloise would lift the blanket and trace the tiny curve of his ear, as if she might memorize it for him. A nurse pressed a thermometer into his groin and said, "He's responding." The tubes and wires and beeps made a kind of new music in my head. Every small rise in his oxygen level felt like a small triumph. Each time his color came back a little more, I felt something else stitch in me: resolve. Late that night, after the hospital quieted and the chairs in the waiting room folded into shadow shapes, Cynthia disappeared. She left without a word.
No one locked the front door of the hospital, and the security footage, later on, would show her walking out under the sodium lights, not running, not stumbling, simply gone. Detective Salazar told me they would look for her and that they would speak to her as soon as they could find her. Her voice was practical and patient, and I clung to it. We thought saving him would answer the questions. It did, but not the way I had imagined. In the days that followed, life peeled into two tracks: the fragile, urgent care of a newborn fighting back from the edge, and the slow, grinding machine of investigation. The hospital became a second home. I slept in a folding chair or an uncomfortable night recliner near the NICU glass. On shift change, I would wake, startled, and see a tiny hand wrapped around my finger, and remember precisely what I was there for. We learned more each hour. The baby had inhaled lake water and his lungs were inflamed. He had a low-grade fever a couple of days in, but the antibiotic took care of that. They stopped some of the tubes and started others, They tried to get him to take a bottle, and when he did, the sound of that small sucking felt like music. Eloise taught me how to sponge him, how to swaddle so his knees didn't splay, how to avoid startling him. I learned the rhythm of the NICU, how long to hold him, when he needed quiet, when the nurse would want to feed him. Fatima and her team pieced together the early timeline. Someone in the neighborhood had a camera that showed Cynthia's truck in the driveway at 4:58 p.m. The footage later showed her standing near the shore and the dark shape of the suitcase hitting water. It was blunt, ordinary evidence given the edges of a television crime show. In real life, it reads like a postcard from an event that refuses to make sense. Fatima told me they would preserve the suitcase and run tests. The county medical examiner would examine the fabrics and search for DNA. Detective Salazar's face hardened in the hours when she thought of Louis. "We are going to look at this from every angle," she said once. "From the vehicle to any financial records. We'll look at all of it." All of it. It sounded like a promise and an entire ocean at the same time. There were small, cruel reminders of Louis everywhere. His old jacket hung in my son's closet, still smelling faintly of his cologne. People brought casseroles and folded into the edges of the day like shadows. Father Anthony came more than once and sat with me while I slept in the plastic reclining chair. He held my hand and read something about endurance and the work of the heart. He prayed in a low voice for the baby, a prayer that felt like a lamp between us. One afternoon, as the baby drew a tentative breath and the monitor chimed softly, Detective Salazar sat down beside me and asked gently if I had any idea whether Louis had been seeing anyone before he died, or if Cynthia had been on her own. There are conversations that strip you.
Grief has a way of protecting you with a kind of fog. I told her what I knew, the late nights Louis had spent at the shop because he couldn't stop working on the old truck, the tense conversations over the phone that had ended with things said too sharp to repeat. I told her about the insurance policy that had seemed ordinary when we first heard about it. She made a note and looked at me like someone performing a delicate operation on your life. Careful, steady, clinical. When they told me they had taken a DNA swab from the infant, a routine step in cases like this, I felt a circle close around my chest. I wanted to know, more than anything, whether he belonged to my family. I wanted the simple anchor of kinship at a time when the world felt adrift. The lab work would take days. Those days were the first of a new kind of slow torture. Each phone ring felt like a small explosion. The state's Child Protective Services needed their own paperwork. Aline, the social worker, explained that while the infant was in the hospital, his case would be marked for immediate attention, an abandoned infant found in hazardous condition. I sat through those conversations with an odd split attention. Part of me focused on Hector's rhythmic, fragile chest, and another part hazard watching the fine print on a custody form. They told me the protocols were to ensure a safe placement. That felt like a bureaucratic tautology that could snap at any moment. I had to prove I could care for him. Even while the baby slept, the state wanted pages filled out, home visits scheduled, background checks run. It was practical and necessary, and in the beginning, crushing. I went home to pack a bag. My house looked like a museum of the life that had been. Louis's photograph still sat on the mantel, and the calendar with his handwriting on it, appointments, a note about a truck part, still hung on the wall. I packed diapers, the few garments that might fit the baby, some of the small toys my grandchildren had left behind when they last visited. I kept thinking about the night Louis had come in late and said, "Mama, I think I'm going to make something right," as if that one sentence held the solution to everything. He had been such a man of small projects. He would tinker and fix, and then come to the house with grease on his hands and an apologetic grin. I miss his hands. I miss the noise he made when he laughed. Cynthia was missing more than anywhere she could be. Detective Salazar had called in an APB. They had spoken to neighbors and to the attendant at the marina who said Cynthia had come down to the dock that morning and left with a cardboard box. A rugged photo of Cynthia went up on their internal board. Her jaw set, scarf around her neck, phone pressed to her ear. We were being careful with our relief, with our joy that Hector had survived. There would be time to swallow and then to act. There was a day when it all felt teetering between ruin and rescue. The baby had a low that morning, a dip in his oxygen stats. My stomach clenched like a fist. Eloise came and sat in the corner of the NICU chair by me and said, "He's stronger than this. He made it through the worst of it." She had a way of counting small things that made hope feel like a stack you could build on. We watched him and listened to the monitor and coaxed him by letting him smell my hair, which for reasons I cannot claim to understand now, seemed to calm him. During a quiet hour, while Hector breathed like a tiny tide, I found myself thinking about choices people make in desperation. Louis had been kind and fumbling and stubbornly principled. Cynthia, in our time together, had been a storm. I did not want to believe that someone I knew, a person who had eaten at our table, who had cried at Lewis's funeral, was capable of this. But then the sight of the suitcase in the water had no room for ambiguity. The world in these moments is not persuadable by sentiment. The weekend after the rescue, Detective Salazar came into the NICU with a slow, careful smile, one that lacked real cheer but held a practical insistence. "We have secured the suitcase," she told me. "There was a smear on the handle. The lab will extract anything they can." She folded her hands and told me they were running all the usual tests. She did not promise outcomes. She offered only work. We fell into a pattern: days at the hospital, nights in a chair, interviews, paperwork, small chores that kept us human, laundry, a cup of tea at 3 a.m. Things moved so slowly they sometimes felt stuck, and sometimes felt like they were sliding too fast. The county lab said it could take a few days to a week to run DNA tests. I learned to stretch myself thin across those days. On the 5th morning after the lake, Fatima sat with me in a small exam room off the NICU. Her face was shaded by the overhead and the fatigue of her schedule. I could tell she had news before she said anything, because she leaned forward and folded her hands like someone bracing for a blow. "We've had some initial results," she said. Her voice was even. She explained that they had been able to extract a sample and that the geneticists were confident in a partial match to a sample they had from Lewis in the state system. I felt the room tilt. Words began to move in and out of sync. Fatima told me they were running confirmatory tests, that Dr. Alan Mendes in the lab was the best man for the job, that these things had to be done by the book. She did not say conclusive yet. She could not. Could it be him? I asked, though a part of me already knew the answer. I wanted the science to come back and tell me what my chest had been saying since I first saw his face. Fatima's eyes met mine, steady, and she said, "They will run the confirmatory test, and when it comes back, we'll let you know." I sat down. The hospital chair felt too small. My hands trembled. My throat closed in a way that made me taste copper.
The world had folded again into one vertical line. Breath in, breath out. Wait. I cradled Hector's tiny hand through the incubator window and thought of Lewis and of all the things that had come apart. I thought of a twisted highway of choices that had made a life end and an infant begin at water's edge. When the detective left, Father Anthony came and anointed Hector's forehead with a small whispered blessing. "God be with him," he said, though he did not claim to know what God would do. Blessing, like medicine, is sometimes a balm only to the giver. I thanked him, and he took my hands and prayed for endurance for me. The prayer was small and honest. It did not solve things. That night I drove home with Hector's small blanket tucked in the passenger seat. The street lights blinked awake like sequins on velvet. I felt like someone who had crossed a river and stood on the further bank looking back at the muddy wake in the dark. I slept in a chair for an hour, dreaming of Lewis talking to me by a truck, saying, "Keep him, Mama." The dream left a warm weight in my arms. The call came in the afternoon, while the baby took a fragile nap. Detective Salazar's voice was low but direct. "They have a match," she said. "The forensic lab's confirmatory test shows the baby's DNA is consistent with Lewis's profile." She said the words in the kind of way that fills the spaces between breaths and leaves you holding the edges of yourself. I went to the NICU and stood at the glass and watched Hector, unaware of how the science of the world had folded him into place. I felt a wash of things: relief, because I now had reason to anchor my fight; grief, because the memory of Lewis surged like an undertow; a cold, hard flare of anger that someone had put my grandson in a suitcase and thrown him into the water. For a long time I did not speak. The lab's finding was a pivot point. It gave legal standing to what had been until then our fractured suspicion. It made the case personal in a way that made action mandatory. Detective Salazar sat beside me at the monitors and said, "This changes how we move forward. We can now tie several strands together." She said it with a tone that suggested careful optimism. "It also raises the stakes for everyone involved." I looked down at Hector's small chest moving up and down and felt that I had been given something fragile and holy and terrible to protect. I had been thrown into the long and complicated machinery of courts and evidence and social workers and the law. But in that moment, I was simply a grandmother who had a baby named Hector and a need to keep him alive. I left the NICU that night with the knowledge lodged in my bones. The suitcase had been thrown into the lake by my daughter-in-law. The baby inside was my grandson. Those two facts sat together like coals that could either be tended into warmth or be used to burn a life down.
I kept thinking of the sound the lake made when the suitcase hit, the ducking, the swallow of water, and how quickly a life can be nearly erased. We had saved him. We had also, suddenly, every reason to believe the small, terrible things we had feared about Lewis's death. There were corners of my life that would now be lit up by investigators, by evidence, by the slow, merciless light of the law. I did not yet know how cold the courtroom would make me feel, or how hot the anger would burn, or how many people would rally to help. I only knew that this was not the moment to despair, and it was not the moment to celebrate. I sat alone in the parking lot and prayed in a voice that sounded like nothing I had known before, 1 part entreaty, 2 parts vow. Keep him. Help me keep him. Give me the strength to stay awake long enough to do what must be done. The answers are not all in prayer. They would be in legal filings, in hospital forms, in DNA reports, and in detectives' notebooks. But prayer steadied me like a hand on the wheel. When I walked back into the NICU, Hector opened his eyes for the first time in my presence. He looked small and perfectly bewildered. His fingers gripped mine like a hinge. I remembered the first time he had been imagined, conversations, plans half-formed, and how the future of Louis's name had attached itself to a single body. The world kept offering tests. In those moments, holding a sleeping baby who had come so nearly to dying, I felt the rawness of being human. I felt, too, a terrible responsibility. Detective Salazar asked me quietly if I would be willing to make a statement. I nodded. She also asked with great care whether I would consider staying involved if they moved on the investigation. She was careful not to ask me to put myself in harm's way. I offered the only answer I could. I would do whatever it took to keep Hector safe. Days later, and that felt like both immediately and an eternity, the lab formally confirmed the match. Dr. Alan Mendes signed off on the report. His handwriting made it official, like a seal. When Fatima called to tell me, she let a soft exhale sound on the phone before speaking. "Betty," she said, "we have the confirmatory result. It's a match to Louis." The paper would be entered into evidence. The lab would hold the samples. The detective asked me to hold that information close for now, that they had steps they needed to take in sequence. I promised. I walked to the window of the NICU and watched the way the October light made the room look like it was built of soupçon and glass. I thought of Louis, and the emptiness he had left in the house and in our lives. I thought of Cynthia's face, blank and small, at the shore as she walked away. I thought of the suitcase sinking, and of the little sound that had saved him. I held his hand and felt the small, astonishing fact of him. He existed. He had been made of Louis and of something else, and now the world would have to find its way to reckon with that. It would be a long road. The evidence would not speak for itself without someone listening. I was listening, with the fierce, slow attention of someone who knows the price of inaction. The hospital would insist on protocols. The state would force forms. The detectives would follow leads. Somewhere in all of that, we would bury the past and dig for truth. I tucked Hector under the thin hospital blanket and watched his chest rise and fall. In the glass, my reflection looked older than I felt, but there was an edge to me now I had not had before, the kind that comes from being handed a task you did not ask for and deciding, without fanfare, to do it. I whispered to him, because whispering was the only thing that seemed right. "We'll keep you. We'll keep you, little one." That night, in the fluorescent hush of the NICU, the machines sang and the world turned slightly, inexorably. I thought of how a single action, the throw of a suitcase, had both threatened and affirmed life. I had been a mother for many kinds of things by then, but never had I been thrust into the role of protector in such a stark legal sense. I felt fear, yes, and I felt the old grief renewed like a bruise pressed. But beneath it all, there was a small, stubborn light. He was here, and he was mine now to guard. When I left the hospital that night, I did not know how it would end. I did not know if Cynthia would be found, or if the fuller story of Louis's death would emerge quickly, or if the paperwork would become a barrier between me and the child slumbering under nurse's care. I only knew that the lake had almost taken him, and that I had waded in and pulled him out, and that now I had to be ready for whatever the rest of the world wanted to do with that fact. There are moments that split your life into before and after. This was one of them. If you're the sort who sits with a story all the way through, stay with me. There are pieces yet to fall into place, and I need you with me for the whole way. After the DNA match, the world rearranged itself into two columns, the care of Hector and the work of the investigation. I moved between them like someone walking the ridge of a roof, careful of where I put my feet. The detectives pushed forward with a steady, methodical patience that felt almost surgical. Detective Fatima Salazar kept me informed in the measured tones of someone who has learned to carry bad news without breaking the person she speaks to. "We have leads on the vehicle," she'd say. "We're following electronic transfers." It was all practical language that held the shape of a breaking life. Social services did what they were required to do. Aline returned with a checklist and a clipboard that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Home visits were scheduled. Background checks for me, for the house, for my car.
They looked at where Hector would sleep. They looked at where he would eat. They asked about smoke detectors and safe storage for anything that could hurt a child. It felt ridiculous to be proving the obvious. I've kept babies for 4 decades, but the forms mattered. The state could be cold, and they could be careful, and in my exhausted gratitude, I understood why both are sometimes necessary. Detective Salazar and Aline coordinated so I could keep Hector close. The first court order was for temporary guardianship. The judge's signature came on a sheet that seemed to radiate authority and the faintest relief. For a while, he was ours because the law allowed it, because the hospital vouched for my competence, and because they recognized the danger in leaving a found infant without family. The papers arrived like a small legal blessing. Keep him safe, and make sure the paperwork keeps pace. In the middle of those days, the lab results began to stack up in a way that made my chest harden. Dr. Alan Mendiz sent a brief clinical email through Detective Salazar. Fibers from the suitcase, metal particulates in the zipper, residues consistent with hydraulic fluid, things that, when piled together, made a pattern. The county mechanic who had examined Lewis's truck at the coroner's office called in a small, trembling affidavit. Someone had tampered with the brake lines. The phrase sabotage lived then in reports and in the mouths of detectives. They spoke carefully of evidence of tampering, of forensic analysis indicating external interference. That was the language that would hold in court, precise and spare. We found out about money. Paper trails do not make human cruelty easier to believe. They only make it easier to prove. Bank transfers, an insurance policy taken out after Lewis's death with Cynthia as beneficiary, a life insurance payment that had been paid out in full. The detectives traced a few transfers offshore to a shell account, and then to a name I had never heard. I remember the moment the list of numbers and dates was laid out on a table in the detective room, like a ledger in a ledgered life, and I could see how someone might think that money could be the motive that knots together silence and malice. Detective Salazar never said motive as if it explained things. She said it as one more thing to be proven, the way a surgeon names an organ before operating. We were given in dribbles and firm memoranda the testimonies that would shape a case. A mechanic named Carlos Medina had been paid to adjust some lines on Lewis's truck, the paperwork suggested. He later testified, after some negotiation with the investigators, that he had been asked to fix a problem and that he had tightened a line in a way that would fail under stress. Carlos did not look like an actor in a drama. He looked like a small, worn man who had been offered money for a favor he now regretted. In a recorded interview, he admitted to bending a metal line, to not checking beyond the part he was paid for. His words were blunt and full of a disappointed voice. That testimony, when combined with the lab's findings, unspooled in my mind with a sick clarity. Someone had planned to make Lewis's death look like an accident. I did not sleep well. I would fall into a dream in which water lapped at the hem of my skirt, and I could not find the shore. When I woke, Hector sometimes made a small O with his mouth, and I would hold him like a talisman against time. People brought casseroles again, and neighbors took turns watching the house while I camped at the hospital. Father Anthony kept coming with small things, a thermos of tea, a reading from a prayer book, the quiet of a man who had learned the power of listening. He prayed with me not for answers, but for endurance. That prayer turned out to be an honest request for strength rather than a demand for miracles, and I needed it. The world of evidence is slow. Things that television shows make seem immediate take weeks or months in real life, because paper has to be found, accounts subpoenaed, lab samples retested. Yet there were moments of suddenness, like the time an officer knocked on the door at 2 a.m. and said, simply, "We have a location for Cynthia." It was as if the air in the room changed. For a while, we were on a new kind of hinge, waiting for the detectives to catch up to the person who had disappeared.
Cynthia, when they found her, had moved in fits and starts. She was not at a dock fighting or running. She had vanished into the kind of place people disappear into when they have both fear and plan. Detectives traced a network of motel stays and a contact who had been passing along small payments. There were soft places where people stop and think and become fugitives. But Cynthia's being found did not mean the case would be tidy. She would not surrender in a neat way. She would not make confessions in small, redemptive minutes. The story the detectives built had to be assembled from fragments and proof. In the lull before something major, we had a discovery that made my stomach drop. Detective Salazar came to the NICU with an evidence bag. Inside was a small leather strap and a smear. "We recovered this from Cynthia's car when she came into custody," she said quietly. The lab would later tie it to fibers from the latch of the suitcase. The chain of evidence was being threaded in front of me. One piece made the next thing sensible. I learned how legal narratives gather themselves, an accumulation of small truths that together will tell a larger one. Cynthia's arrest was not a cinematic moment. It happened in a motel off a tired highway, with officers in plain clothes who had practiced the steps many times. There were no fireworks, no dramatic handcuffs on a dock.
There was, however, a sudden, ordinary ending to a long, anxious wait. A woman asked to come out of a motel room and placed her hands on a sink and looked at herself in a mirror, while a small voice on the radio called her name. She did not seem surprised. She only seemed tired. When she was brought into custody, Detective Salazar read her rights and tried to keep the interview clinical. Cynthia, under the bright lights of an interrogation room, was different from how she'd been at the shore or in the parking lot outside the hospital. She had the flat look of someone whose river had been dammed and whose water had nowhere to go. She denied certain charges at first. She recounted some things, denied others. Her voice sometimes cracked. Sometimes it was flat, as if she had practiced the story until it would not surprise her. One of the pieces that had hung over the case like a shape in fog was a recorded phone call I had made to Cynthia a few weeks after she ran. I had been furious and afraid. My hands trembled when I pressed record on the phone, but I had been steady enough in voice to coax a confession. In it, she said things she'd later try to walk back, words I replayed in my head like a rock beaten on a doorstep. I had not intended to set a trap for a confession. I had only wanted to hear a truth from a woman I had once loved as family. The detectives used that recording as a thread in a larger weave. It was not the only thing that mattered, but it was a thing that would later be threaded through the evidence and the testimony. As the case moved forward, it required more of me than I had thought possible. There were depositions where I had to sit and answer questions about small details of the day, what I had been wearing, the exact time of the splash, how long Cynthia had stood on the shore. Each question felt like someone taking a small slice out of a living memory and setting it in amber for examination. I found myself revisiting the day in a way that hurt. I also found that I could answer clearly. My grief, sharpened by the need for truth, became a tool of clarity among the fog. Detective Salazar and her team set up a sting. I remember telling myself I would not let them use me as bait. Then, after long private conversations, I agreed to wear a wire in a controlled situation. The plan was to lure Cynthia into a place where the police could make an arrest and where a recorded confession would be certifiable in court. I did not imagine the way fear would live in my body in the days before the meeting. You learn in long winters of the soul that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move despite it. We rehearsed the steps like an army preparing a small siege. Officers coached me on where to stand, what to say if things went wrong, how to preserve the wire. Detective Salazar asked if I was sure. She asked it gently, like a doctor asking consent before a risky but necessary operation. Father Anthony prayed over me and placed a hand on my shoulder. His blessing was small and steady, and not an invocation of destiny, but of comfort. Eloise came to the house and sat with Hector while I went to the meeting place. The community around me, which had gathered at my kitchen table and at the hospital waiting room like a swarm of human hands, pulled taut like a safety net. The day of the planned meeting felt heavy with weather, though the sky was clear. The warehouse we chose, an abandoned storefront by the river, smelled of rust and damp cardboard. There were details that are absurdly mundane, the way the fluorescent bulbs buzzed, the taste of dust on my tongue as I moved through the parking lot. The detectives were in position, all the officers dressed down and ready. I walked in with my small bag, with a sweater that would keep me warm, and with the weight of the wire pressed against my chest like a secret. Cynthia arrived late, winded from running, hair disordered. She approached like someone stepping into theater who was not certain of the lines. She looked at me as if looking at a mirror of something she had once been. I sat on a discarded crate and opened my mouth and said the words we'd agreed on. It felt ridiculous to make small talk in a place like that, but that is what the plan asked for. Questions were bait. She started to talk. At first, it was the kind of story people tell when they want sympathy, the smooth, practiced catalog of trouble. Then the tenor shifted. She used the very phrases she had used in that phone call, the ones I had recorded months before. Her voice dropped, and for a moment I felt the air move out of me. "I didn't mean for him to die," she said. "I only wanted him gone from our house. I thought he'd be scared. I didn't expect." The confession came like a small, disoriented cave-in. She described things in the flat, stripped way of someone cataloging logistics, where the brake line had been loosened, how a hand had been paid to make a small adjustment. She explained things like someone reciting a list. Her hands found a small pistol inside her coat. She hadn't meant to bring it, or so she later said. That moment of her hand reaching was the one I will never quite forget. Time contracted. The world narrowed into a clean strike. Hand, bright metal, a flash of intent. She turned, and before I could think to move my own body, a reaction programmed by 52 years of reflex, I felt a hot stinging in my shoulder. It was a sharp, raw shock, and then there was a weight of pain that made my breath shallow and quick. I remember tasting iron and thinking of Lewis's laugh in some impossible overlay. The police moved as they had been trained to do. They hit the room like a wind, plainclothes men and women filling the doorway and then the space around us. One officer grabbed Cynthia's arm. Another pried the gun from her hand. I felt the world tilt on its axis and settle into a different gravity. There was shouting, practical, clipped orders, and then the echoing quiet that follows. The room was suddenly full of people, and suddenly very still. They led Cynthia away in handcuffs. I remember someone saying her rights again, as if the formality would tether everything that had been frayed. Detective Salazar crouched beside me. "They got what they needed," she said. "We have a recorded confession. We have your statement. You did exactly right." Her voice was a rope I gratefully grabbed. I bled a little and had shrapnel of pain for a short while, wounds that would stitch up, I knew, because I'd seen enough of emergency rooms that day. Paramedics later said I had a gunshot wound to the shoulder. They dressed it, stitched it, and gave me a pain medicine that made the world feel like a dimmed painting for a few hours. I remember lying on a cot while pieces of the night rearranged themselves in my head like cards shifting in a deck. I had been shot in the line of saving a life. The thought made me both furious and strangely calm. Cynthia's confession, recorded on the wire and on multiple devices, became a central piece of evidence. The prosecution later played selections in court, not for the sake of drama, but to demonstrate a thread of planning and intent. Her words in a small, crowded room, captured on devices the police had carefully placed, cannot be unspoken. That audio, combined with the brake tampering evidence, Carlos Medina's testimony, the financial transfers, and the suitcase itself, became the spine of the case. I was a witness, and the role of being called to testify is an odd one. One stands in a place that feels like the middle of a riverbed, with lawyers on either bank throwing their nets and questions across. The defense tried to poke holes where they could. They suggested possibility, they offered alternative explanations, they attempted to sow doubt in the shape of rhetorical questions. The prosecutor, patient and precise, threaded the evidence back into a story that had coherence. Lewis's death, the financial motives, the physical means, and the attempt to erase an infant in a suitcase. They presented the lab reports, Dr. Mendy's conclusions, the bank statements, Carlos's affidavit and in-person account, and the recorded confession. I testified on 2 separate occasions. The first time I was raw, the wound of the day still bleeding in my shoulder. The second time, a month later, I had recovered enough that my voice was steadier. Telling the truth again and again is like scraping a scab. It hurts, and then the tissue underneath hardens. I told the court about running to the shore, about the sound that made me realize there was life inside the luggage, about putting my hands into cold water and praying silently with every pull. I told them about the smell of damp cloth and of lavender from my mother's Afghan, because truth needs the small details to feel like it belongs to the world. The trial was long, or it felt so to me, not because of the hours, but because of the slow grinding of it. Witnesses called, cross-examinations that tried to test the edges of memory, the replaying of audio in the sterile, cavernous courtroom. There were moments that left me lightheaded, A coroner's explanation of how a failure in braking could cause a fatal crash. A financial expert mapping the transfers that had gone into a shell account. Carlos on the stand, describing the call he'd received, offering him money for work that was not to be checked. The defense tried to recast Cynthia's actions as a moment of panic rather than premeditated violence. The jury had to weigh the timeline, the evidence, and the recorded words. When the jury returned with a verdict, time condensed into 2 words: guilty on all counts. They found Cynthia guilty of first-degree murder in Lewis's death and guilty of attempted murder related to the infant and to the shooting against me. The judge pronounced the conviction with a cadence that felt like a finality of a book being closed. The defense requested an appeal, as is their right. The law is a long apparatus. I felt neither triumph nor vengeance. Instead, I felt an enormous, heavy relief, like someone finally closing a drawer that had been left open for months. Sentencing followed the conviction. The judge, reading from the bench, imposed a sentence in accordance with the counts on which Cynthia was convicted. The transcripts reflect the judge's decision. The thing I remember most vividly is not the precise number of years or the legal phrasing, but the silence in the room that followed the judge's reading. It was a different sort of quiet than the one that had wrapped the NICU. This quiet held more of a settling. Justice had its own slow machinery, imperfect and human and necessary, and for once it had moved toward a shape that allowed me to breathe. In parallel to the criminal proceedings were the civil scaffolds that would decide Hector's legal future. Temporary guardianship was followed by a custody hearing. Social workers had to testify to my fitness and to the safety of my home. I remember Aline's testimony, how she had watched me in the hospital as I learned to change tubes, as I learned to swaddle, as I had tried to sleep in a plastic recliner and still find the vigilance to hold Hector when the monitors chirped. The court had to be convinced not only that I loved him, but that I could provide a stable environment. I had a clean record, a home with a spare room, and a community that vouched for me. When the judge awarded temporary custody to me, I cried so hard I could not catch the shape of words. The papers were handed across a table by a clerk who wore thin gloves and moved as though handling fragile things. I walked out of that courthouse with Hector tucked in a sling against my chest and a small sense of triumph that was more relief than celebration.
The state had acted as if to protect him until a long-term decision could be made. We had survived the machinery of bureaucracy and emerged with a small legal anchor. Adoption, the final legal step that would make Hector legally mine, took longer still. It is one thing for a judge to hand down custody in the middle of an emergency. It is another to permanently change the legal ties that bind a child to their parentage. Cynthia's conviction did not on its own erase the biological fact of maternity. It did, however, become decisive in the moral and legal argument that she should not be granted the rights to raise a child she had harmed. We went through home studies, legal filings, background checks anew, financial affidavits, and a court-appointed attorney who represented Hector's best interests. We did the classes they required: parenting classes, safe sleep workshops, first aid certification. I went through them because the paperwork was a part of the justice that would make this child's life legible and protected. There were advocates who helped. A women's shelter counselor who had once done pro bono work in family law sat with me in a dim office and explained the path to adoption in clear, unadorned language. "It will be paperwork," she said, "and it will be long, and it will be worth it." She spoke as someone who had seen the way patience can be a hand in the dark. Father Anthony spoke to the court on our behalf. He did not make any grand claims. He simply testified to the care I had shown for Hector and to the community's commitment to his welfare. The adoption was finally granted some months later. In the judge's chamber, the small set of papers that declared me Hector's legal mother felt heavier than a ledger. The clerk slid them across the desk and said simply, "Congratulations." I had imagined the word for so long that hearing it felt like a strange old song returning to a house. When we left the courthouse, the autumn sun was lower, and the air had that clean, sharp feel of change. I walked to the car with Hector on my chest, and people I had come to rely on, Eloise, Father Anthony, a neighbor who had taken shifts watching my porch light, were there with quiet smiles. Healing did not arrive all at once. Grief is a presence that lingers like an old friend and an unwanted houseguest. Sometimes in the quiet of night, I would wake and see Lewis's empty chair in the kitchen, and the memory of his laugh would make my throat hurt like a too tight band. I would look at Hector sleeping and feel both the sweetness of a new life and the ache of the one that had gone. There were milestones that were small and huge. The first time Hector smiled directly at me,
as if answering a joke only I had told. The first time he rolled over and then laughed. The first time he took unsteady steps, one by one, like a small congress of independent decisions. Our house filled up again with the warm, ordinary noise of living.
We painted a corner of a room pale green and put up a small crib with a handmade quilt a friend had stitched. The teacup with a faint crack that Louis used to joke about sat on the counter, as if he could look in and fold into our days. I found myself humming an old lullaby my mother had sung, just a line at first, then whole verses. There were times I would find myself talking to Hector about his father, in the same way you might talk to someone so they know they are wanted, even when not all facts can be spoken. A soft recitation of small, true things. Your daddy loved trucks, I'd say. He loved late-night projects and coffee that was too weak for him, and stubborn jokes. I made a small shrine in the living room, a photograph of Louis, a candle that Father Anthony said was okay to light on certain days, and a small wooden boat, Hector's namesake, in a way, for the place he had been found. It was not for ritual so much as for memory. It was my way of keeping grief visible without letting it take over. Friends and neighbors continued to bring casseroles. There were visitors who came and went, and their faces formed a nap of community. Some stopped by to pray, some to listen, some to offer practical help like grocery runs or picking up dry cleaning. The public life of the case eventually quieted down. Newspapers printed the verdict and then moved on to other things. Internet forums debated and then softened into other threads. For us, the real work of healing was private. A woman who had been badly hurt finds a new center in the small rituals of parenting, feeding a child at midnight, reading a badly preserved picture book, learning the angles of a small shoe. I learned to let the ordinary be a kind of medicine. Even as the days rounded into months, there were administrative echoes, appeals, parole hearings in other cases, the occasional phone call from a court clerk asking for signature. Cynthia's legal appeals were part of the machinery that keeps a legal system balanced. They were not for me things that reopened wounds, so much as reminders that the law is slow, and in its slowness it is often merciful and often maddening. I did not gloat over convictions. I only felt the relief of knowing Hector could grow within walls and laws that recognized the danger he had once faced. There were small ceremonies of recovery. One winter we gathered at the church, and the little group that had been our anchor, Father Anthony, Eloise, Detective Salazar, and Civies, who had become a friend in sharp-edged ways, stood with us as Hector was blessed. The priest's words were quiet, unceremonious. He did not promise that pain would disappear. Instead, he offered a sturdy phrase, "Let us tend what we can." We took that as permission to do the small things, to feed, to teach, to love, to remember. Hector grew into a boy who loved water, not a shore, not the place that had once almost taken his life, but the small safety of a shallow pool or a bucket on a summer day. He liked the way soap bubbles formed and popped, and he loved to sit on my porch and watch the street the way little boys watch stories unroll. Once, when he was 6, he found a tiny plastic boat in the gutter and stood before me solemn as a judge and said, "We have to be careful with things that float." He did not know the weight of what he said. I did. He said it as a child says things that are literal and enormous at once. There were anniversaries that arrived like storms. 6 months after the lake, the sky was the same color as it had been the day of the rescue, and I could not bear to be alone. That afternoon, we went to the cemetery and stood by Louis's grave. I placed a small toy truck on the stone and breathed words into the cold. I told him about Hector's first steps and about the way his laugh had a small edge to it that sounded like someone new. I thanked him for whatever part of his life had affixed this child to ours. The sky was indifferent, and the maples hissed. I left a little of myself there, like a tucked note. People asked, over the months, how I managed to do the things I did, the hospital vigils, the court dates, the late-night phone calls with lawyers, the learning to be a parent to a child who had lost his father. I usually told them the simple truth: love. It sounds simple because it is simple. Love is the shape that makes you move when the rest of the world feels impossible. It is the thing that makes you get up at 3 a.m. to soothe a cry. It is the thing that makes you write letters to judges and show up for hearings. Faith helped. Father Anthony's prayers, the kindness of the community. But practical love, the kind that changes diapers and pays bills and learns first aid, was what kept Hector alive. Sometimes, in quiet hours, I would think about the choice Cynthia had made.
The question of why is one that sits in the same room as grief and frustration. Detectives and courts answered parts of it with evidence and experts. They showed papers and transfers and numbers that made a motive look like a map. But why never becomes neat. No amount of paper fully accounts for the hours someone takes a lethal step. I found the acceptance of that uncertainty to be a part of the work of peace. I would rather walk forward with truth at my side than attempt to peer into the dark center of another person's mind. There were small rewards that felt enormous. The first time Hector called me Mama felt like a song returned. The first birthday, his first outside of the hospital, was a gathering we kept small. Balloons, a dish of cake, the soft light of a living room that felt safe. We invited people who had been on the journey with us. Detective Salazar came and stood in the kitchen doorway, a plate of cookies in hand, looking a little shy in a way she never was in interrogations. Carlos Medina did not come. I think his remorse was a private thing he had to bear.
The neighbor who had watched our house brought a small wooden toy boat he'd carved, and when Hector played with it, I felt like I had passed something on, an ordinary object infused with extraordinary meaning. I do not tell this story as a boast. I tell it as a testimony to the way ordinary people do hard, extraordinary things. Nurses who never left the NICU, detectives who followed paper trails, a priest who read a psalm in the middle of an emergency, friends who brought casseroles. These are the hands of community. The law did its job in convicting Cynthia and in granting custody and adoption. Medicine did its job in saving Hector from the immediate dangers of hypothermia and aspiration. God, if God moves in things like these, seemed to move in the small spaces: a paramedic's steady hands, a nurse's lullaby, a prosecutor's patience. I cannot and will not claim miracles as guarantees. I will say only that some combination of human aid, medical skill, and perhaps providence kept a life intact. People sometimes ask me how I sleep now. The truth is, in fits and starts. Trauma does not evaporate when a verdict appears on paper. I carry scars, both mental and physical. I still recoil at sudden splashes of water, and the sound of a suitcase hitting a sidewalk is something that will never be neutral to me. But there are more mornings than nights where I wake and find Hector smiling at me with an unburdened face, and that is enough. The boy who once had purple lips and clinging small hands is now a child who hums under his breath and asks endless questions. He asks about trucks and about stars. He asks about his father, and I answer with stories that are careful and honest, and full of the way a life, even cut short, can be a blessing. On quiet evenings, I will take him to the lake, never near the docks. That place has a different height of meaning now, and we will toss bread to the ducks. He will watch the ripples and giggle at how the water moves. I once thought the lake had only taken. Now, in a small, complicated way, the lake is where his story began and where we learned how thinly life hangs and how fiercely it can be held. We respect it and keep our distance. We are not naive. We are vigilant in a way we must be. If you ask me what the hardest part of all of this has been, I would say it is learning to carry grief without letting it become my entire identity. Louis will always be a part of me. His absence is a hollowness that returned when I least expected. But grief should not be the thing that defines the child in your arms. My job is to let Hector become himself, not always a reminder of a tragedy. That is why the kitchen smells of cookies and the living room of toy boats. That is why we go to the park and color in big squares of paper. That is why I let laughter live in our house again. People sometimes ask me what I would tell Cynthia if I had the chance. I will not repeat the harsh words I have felt in my heart.
I will say what I would want a court or a conversation to record: that harm has consequences, that care matters, that we must choose life. I will also say that the urge to understand does not mean forgivelessness or forgetting. I do not wish her harm beyond what the law judged. I wish for a world where the choice she made would be unthinkable for anyone. There were small acts of kindness that saved me in ways no court could. Eloise, the nurse, taught me to hum softly into a small's ear when he is upset, and to make a face at the right moment to get a laugh. Father Anthony planted a small rosemary bush outside my back door, saying in his quiet way that remembrance can be tended. Detective Salazar, who still checks on Hector sometimes with a small wrapped cookie from the courthouse vending machine, became not a friend but a steady presence whose work changed our lives. I owe a great deal to these people. Their names are part of this story because ordinary people did extraordinary work. The years have a way of softening the edges.
Sometimes I will stand in the kitchen and catch myself watching Hector as he builds a block tower, and I will remember how small and fragile he was. Sometimes a line of his father's will make its way into his mouth in a harmless repetition of a joke. "Mama, did Daddy ever use glue for everything?" he will ask, and I will laugh with the memory. Those moments stitch things back together. They do not fix what was broken. They build over it a new life. If I have learned anything from this long, difficult chapter, it is that love does not save us from pain. It asks us to become larger than our fear in order to protect what matters. It made me stand in a warehouse with a wire on my chest and the knowledge that I could be hurt for the sake of a child's safety. It made me file through the legal rack and fight with a stubbornness I did not know I had. It made me a less patient woman with paperwork and a more patient woman with the living things I cared for. Hector is almost 7 now. He knows enough of his story to understand that he came into this world with complications, but not so much that he carries blame. He has favorite foods and a favorite blanket and a dangerous habit of leaving his shoes where guests trip over them. He calls me Mama before he calls anyone else Mama, and the word falls into the house like a bell. It rings. I sleep better than I used to. I still wake sometimes with a sharp echo of that day, but the echoes come less often. I keep Lewis's memory alive in small and careful ways. At birthdays, we set a place at the table with a small toy truck, and we tell little stories about him, how he once fixed the squeak in the dining chair with nothing but a pocket screwdriver and stubbornness. Speaking his name aloud does not dim the life of this house, it deepens it. We do not erase who came before, we invite it to sit at our table.
If you have listened this far, thank you for witnessing a small, hard life and the work of people who made it possible. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to Elderly Stories and leaving a comment about resilience or family below. Tell us about someone who helped you through a dark place. The small human thread of help is the thing that stitches communities together. I look at Hector as he sleeps now in the next room. The nightlight makes a soft pool of color on the wall. I remember the teacup on the sill, the clock at 5:15, the way water swallowed a suitcase and almost swallowed a life. I remember the smell of lake water and the feeling of cold in my knees. I remember the sharpness of grief and the slow, odd comfort of a courtroom decision. Mostly, I remember the small, stubborn fact of his breath in my arms the first time I warmed him, that tiny proof that life can be reclaimed if the world is willing to fight for it. There are moments that split your life into before and after. That day with the suitcase did that for me. What was inside left me frozen at first, then furious, then fierce. It forced me into a role I would not have chosen, but that I discovered I could fulfill. It turned my grief into a kind of labor, of law, of care, of love. This is my story. I am not a hero, only a woman who listened to the small voice that said, "Go." I went into the lake and I pulled out a child, and I kept him, and in keeping him I found a way to keep myself from being broken by what we had lost. If you have been moved by this, please share this story with someone who needs to hear about the strange, stubborn ways love holds. Thank you for staying with me.